All right, teammates. We are back once again. If this is your first time listening to the Move Swiftly podcast, welcome to the show. Welcome to the number one show on innovative teamwork. Great to have you. To my regular listeners, it's now become your expectation. You know I bring nothing but the best. Great people that have a great mission, a great story, and they are simply here to help you. It's Dr. Julie Pham, who, I would attempt to just list off her resume and everything that she's done, but I'm not. That's going to take a pod in itself. I will tell you that you are going to completely change the way you think about the word curiosity by the end of this episode. She has a TED talk that I was listening to actually before we got on, and it really, me as the innovative teamwork guy, I had my notes out. I had certain things I was taking and made sure I wanted to ask her once I had her on. So with all that, Dr. Julie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Aswan.
Yes. So, like I was saying, you have broken into a concept about curiosity that has been like just a fantastic way of thinking about your expectations, what you get, and the whole thing. But before we get there, I want to kind of give you the opportunity now to talk a little bit about your background, because one of the things that actually intrigued me about the way you grew up is that your parents actually ran their own newspaper that eventually you and your brother bought, and you learned the business and things like that. And so much of that is important. Your upbringing is so very important in regards to what you decide you're going to do as an adult. So, the floor is yours to kind of speak on your upbringing a little bit.
Yeah,
We'll go from there.
yeah. So a really important part of my identity is that I am a Vietnamese boat person. My parents and I came here when I was a 2-month-old baby, and
Mhm.
then my parents started the first privately owned Vietnamese newspaper in the Pacific Northwest in
And
Seattle.
right.
And so I grew up with the newspaper and never thought I would work in it. And then I decided to, when I went to undergrad, I decided to become a historian. And so I actually ended up pursuing my PhD in history
Oh, okay.
and realized I didn't want to stay in academia and I wanted to go into business and I didn't want to get an MBA. I didn't want to go back to school. And so I
Right.
actually came back to Seattle to help run the newspaper in
Mhm.
2008. So during the Great Recession. And that was my real life MBA. I learned so much from running the newspaper
Yeah.
during a time of great scarcity.
Right.
So I did that for 3 years alongside my parents and my brother.
Mhm.
And I was just making so little money. And by the
Yeah,
way,
well,
I was
that
also so
actually leads
much,
me to a question though, because you said 2008, right?
yeah,
Now, social media was becoming a thing, and people were getting their news from these phones, so,
absolutely.
like selling the hard physical copies of newspaper. That you're right. That would be way more of a lesson than any business school, any MBA can teach you. So let's stay there for a little bit. Like, what were some of the challenges that you were dealing with as you saw people transitioning from just getting a newspaper to now I'm just going to look it up on Twitter and figure out what it is I want to look up?
So it was the global decline of our industry. And yet we were also serving a Vietnamese readership. So we actually still have a bit more time because a lot of our readers still depend on the print. They're not going straight to social media, to the internet. And yet advertisers were changing their expectations of of the return. And so everything was changing.
Mm-hmm.
And it just became so much harder. And so what we ended up having to do is a lot more partnerships.
Hmm.
So we actually I created a ethnic media coalition. So bringing together
Really?
people from different, from the Chinese newspapers, the Spanish speaking,
Right.
the African newspapers, the African American, like all of these different communities. It's like, how do we do more
Mm-hmm.
together? How do we support one another? Because we actually have similar challenges.
Yes. So, what were one of some of the part? Well, first of all, I want to make sure I make the point to the listeners as well. When these things happen in business and they're inevitably going to happen, it's important that you do get creative. It's important that you do figure things out because that can ultimately lead you to your next phase in life and what you're going to be doing next. And like you mentioned, you were a history major, and in many ways, one of my favorite authors, actually, Malcolm Gladwell, the author of
Mhm.
Outliers, he was a history major, and you see the work he's done. So knowing your history and then having that experience in business, that mix can create something incredibly important. So, with that, what did the when you were approaching them and making the partnerships, how did it look? Kind of walk us through the framework of what you use to gauge these people to create partnerships, because that kind of leads into kind of what the work you're doing now in work
Mhm.
environments.
It's just that even though we serve really different communities, we had similar challenges.
Mm-hmm.
And we were all being hit by the fact of all of our advertisers were drying up, and there was still a even stronger need for our in language material. And so how do we get scrappy together? And there were grants for content, but there weren't, we didn't, a lot of us started as just being passionate about serving our community. We didn't know how to be businesses.
Yeah, that's what's
That's
up.
the and so what I ended up doing was I didn't even know the word at the time. I didn't know it was called private public partnership, but that's what I ended up creating. So I
Yeah.
was just, hey, there are all of these government agencies and nonprofits and private businesses that want to use us to reach out to our communities. So
Okay.
what if we were to create a capacity building program, like a learning program where those different organizations would give us their knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
and in exchange they would get to be connected with us. So I'm going to give you an example.
Yeah.
The Seattle Public Library, they have all of these free databases on how to do market research,
Wow.
right? There was a PR company that of course wanted to get connected to us, and so that we said, hey, well, can you help us distinguish how this Chinese newspaper is different from that Chinese newspaper? How can you help us teach us that? Comcast, they helped us with how do we even start to sell internet advertising? And
Huh.
so all of those different organizations had something to give, some knowledge to give. And so what we said was, let's create a win-win situation.
Uh-oh.
And you get
Covey
something
again.
and
There he
we get
is.
something.
Stephen
And how do we
Covey.
come
Win-win.
together,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we make 1 + 1 = 3? That's
Mm-hmm.
what I'm constantly thinking about. How do we do more with less?
Mm-hmm. All right, so that happens, and are you just going right into the working world, or do you still? Because I know you mentioned you were an educator as well. You spent some time doing that. When did this transition hit you? Sort of the epiphany hit you to where there's something curious. I think you had mentioned something about you got on a Zoom and someone said you weren't working well or something like that. So I'll let you kind of fill in the blanks when it comes to
Yeah, yeah,
that, and
yeah.
then the TED Talk and how you're
Yeah,
able to do that.
yeah. So I was trained as an academic, but what I realized is in academic and in research is it's very much about outward curiosity, pursuing new knowledge, accumulating that knowledge.
Mhm.
And then when I started working at the newspaper and doing community building, I realized, whoa, there's so much to be learned from one another, from other people, from
Yeah,
conversations, not
yeah.
just book learning or research learning,
Mhm.
right? And then I got, and this is how I got even more curious about curiosity or understanding the importance of curiosity,
Mhm.
was recognizing how its impact on collaboration. So I actually had brought together people from different backgrounds from different sectors. And what I noticed were the teams that did really well, or there are people who did really well, and there are people who really struggled. And the people who really struggled were those who were focused on the outcome, only on the outcome. And
Mhm.
those who did really well, or who were really thriving, were those who were just, look at what I'm learning. I
Mhm.
had no idea. We
Mhm.
created something out of nothing. And
Right.
their attitude was contagious.
Yeah.
But the thing is, if you had on any team a critical mass of people who were only focused on the outcome, it could take down the morale of the team too. And
Right.
so that was kind of my epiphany for like, oh, this is why curiosity on teams is so important. And that's why I decided to make a whole business out of it.
Right. So okay,
So
you're making this business, and did you just jump right into like entrepreneurship and getting clients and delivering workshops right away, or was there some process towards building that to the point? Because I'm thinking about your TED Talk, and you said specifically
mhm,
you were on a Zoom call and someone said
yeah,
the worst ever presentation.
yes, yeah,
You were like,
I'll share that.
whoa.
So I
You
was
were like,
actually already in my business. So I was actually already in my business. At
uh-huh.
that point, I think I was in my business already a good solid year. And so this is also kind of speaks to we can continue to learn. Here I had this whole business on curiosity. I'm training people on
Yeah.
curiosity. And that's when I had this big epiphany moment. Wow, curiosity is a practice. Because I had this person who I was given my talking about 7 forms of respect. And then this person was just, this is a waste of my time.
Yeah. Yep.
And
Absolutely.
I just got, inside I'm feeling super defensive and
It's
all of
your
the
business, your
feels,
baby. Yeah, yeah.
right?
I know I
Right?
would. Damn right.
Right. And then I actually like to process through talking it through with people. And so I had to practice some inward curiosity of why am I actually feeling this way?
Hmm.
And that's when I realized, wow, she's a curious person, just
Hmm.
like I'm a curious person. We're not always curious though. We can't always be curious. And so that's when I start to think about curiosity as a practice. Because normally we talk about curiosity like it's a trait. You either have it or you don't. I think we all have it. It's just sometimes we don't practice it. And it actually takes more courage
Yes.
and more self-awareness to admit when we don't. And so I had to admit in that moment when I
Mhm.
was feeling super defensive. And also, my expectation was, of course, she would love my work. And she
Mhm.
didn't,
Yeah.
or at least she wouldn't be rude about it. Right.
Mhm.
And so I had to practice inward curiosity of why was I having all of those expectations. And that's when I had this big epiphany. Wow, curiosity is actually a practice. And if we can think about it that way, it's less it's less judgy, because normally people, well, you just need to be more curious.
Yeah, exactly. They say it as
And
if it's a patronizing tone whenever
yeah,
you normally hear the word.
like it's a character flaw or something, right? But
Mhm.
like actually, how about we look at the environment that causes us for sometimes maybe I'm not feeling safe at work, or maybe I don't see my managers modeling it, or
Exactly.
maybe when I see other people ask questions, they get knocked down. So I'm like, oh, I better not ask a question. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe there's everything is so fast paced, there's no time for self-reflection.
Right.
So that was my big aha of just no, curiosity is a practice, and we can actually help organizations
Exactly.
guide them through that. And then you asked me as one of did it start right away? So I had a fully functioning business
Mm-hmm.
when I had that epiphany moment, and
Oh, okay.
it really, and I actually then ended up, and it took me even more of like a year of processing that whole experience,
Mm-hmm.
to then it became a part of my core messaging.
Exactly right. Like you're the foundation, right?
Yeah. So I think for entrepreneurs, not to be afraid of change,
Yes.
of like, I thought I was offering this,
Mm-hmm.
but I've got to refine it. And it's constantly iterating, and not to be afraid of that. Even if but I already put it on the website and I already did this. And it's like, that's okay. It can
Yeah.
still change.
Exactly, exactly. I actually I'm a part of a group coaching program. Shout out to Dre. The name of his company is called Work on Your Game University. And
Mhm.
he is a former basketball player. And I remember I had him on the show and I asked him, how'd you come up with the title, whatever. He goes, man, I was just playing basketball and I just was talking to the camera and I was telling people that were asking me comments, go work on your game. And all of a sudden it becomes his business, becomes the way he plants his flag. And he said it right here on this show. Like, I never planned on making a business out of it. It's just something
Mhm.
that came out of my mouth while I was actually working on my game. And I was
Mhm.
telling people stop doing that. So you touched on a point that I've been guilty of. I mean, most of the people that know me have said this to me so many different times. They like, Aswan, your expectations are too high for people. Your expectations are too high for people. Now, that's not something I know how to change necessarily, but I understand the concept and the principle of when you start expecting things, it's hard to break out of that. It's hard to teach people to expect, but you do something that's magnificent, in my opinion, in your TED Talk, where you have an expectation and then you have a gap between what you get and your expectation. And there's a framework there. There's a sense of learning that, again, I was learning things. I'd love for you to kind of share that a little bit because the end part is so incredible. Guys, go watch the TED Talk for yourself. But the end part, when you get that get part, was like I'll even show you on my phone. I took pictures of it.
Oh.
Yeah, it's all right here, man. Like when it comes to what you get, the whole thing. So where is it? Yes, right there. This part. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, okay. I innovative teamwork guy thinking I know everything about teamwork. I'm like, okay, let's do it. So yeah, walk us through that gap
Yeah, so I
between
have
the
so what I
expectation
call
and
is
what you
there's this gap
Mhm,
between what we expect and what we get.
yeah,
And then in that gap can actually, because we're so fixated on, well, I was supposed to get this. This was
yeah,
my expectation.
yeah,
And that can actually make it really hard for us to actually even face or deal with what we actually get. And
exactly.
even, and the way I illustrate this is even the way when we start to move across it, things look different. At
Hmm.
every point, we're turning back and we're just, wait a minute, what was my original
You
expectation?
didn't
And
expect
the
that, right?
further away we move from it, it's just, oh, and it's
Yeah.
just like that's the thing. We just need some distance and time and space to look at it. And so there are three steps that I talk about. There's assess, ask, and share. And so the assess is just even assessing our readiness to leave behind our expectations. And
Hmm.
so there are these two questions I pose to the audience, which is the first one is if you're thinking about that person who you've got this expectation and they didn't meet your expectation,
Hmm.
the first thing, and you're just like, I'm about to have this conversation with them,
Yeah.
like with that woman who said, this is a waste of my time. And it's
Right.
just, do I want them to learn from me?
Right.
It's like,
So
of course I do.
let me pause you real
Mhm.
quick because I want to
Yeah.
give a real life example.
Yeah. Mhm.
I used to teach. It was a daycare slash educator position. It's
Mhm.
called kindercare, and they hire people left and right. It's incredibly transient industry.
Mhm.
Somebody got hired that had years of experience as a daycare, like just I mean tons of experience, and she did not show up on time. She didn't know what to do with the kid. So many things were wrong, and I remember having a conversation with the director where my expectation for this girl when I looked at her resume and I hired her on the spot was
Mhm.
not at all what I got. And then that boiled down to, do I assess how I'm hiring? Do I try to learn? So that assess piece right there,
Mhm.
again, it's you cannot skip that, because when you can learn from your mistakes or learn from another person, that's when the next phase goes. So good.
Yeah, yeah, because we have to actually be willing to ask ourselves, do I want to, am I open to learning? Am I willing to learn?
Yes.
And then and then the next part is to ask ourselves these questions of where are these expectations coming from? What
Mhm.
are other ways of seeing that? And then to share. And then the sharing part is to talk about what you're learning. And sometimes people feel ashamed of this.
Yes.
They don't want to admit that. I mean, when I asked myself what were my expectations, I realized I felt entitled to getting a good positive response from the audience. And that was kind of embarrassing to admit.
Yeah. Yeah.
But when I share that with people,
All right.
right? And it's like then they're giving me their interpretations.
Uh-huh.
And it's just like, oh, I wouldn't have even interpreted it that way. And so we have to kind of be open
Hmm.
to after we practice inward curiosity, we then have to practice outward curiosity and talk about it with other people.
Hmm.
And
So
that's when we let people in.
right. This framework that you've been able to create, though, it can carry over in a lot of different facets in life, a lot of different industries. What was it that made you plant your flag in the work environment specifically?
That's where we spend most of our waking hours.
Yeah.
That is where we spend more time with our colleagues than our loved ones, than our best friends, or
Hmm.
even our casual friends. Like we spend
Right.
more time with, and so how we feel at work is actually going to affect every other part of our lives.
Yeah.
Even if we don't talk about it with our partners, but we're bottling it in and they know something's wrong, but we don't. So
Right.
it's really hard for people to actually separate. There are some people who can say, this is work and this is home. And they have a very, but most people,
That's how I
they
grew up.
carry it.
I
They may
mean,
not express
you
it, but
know what it's
they
like to.
carry
I
it.
mean, my dad was he was ran his own company. I mean, it was where he was working literally in the house. But you already, I'm preaching to the choir with that, so you already know what it's
Mhm.
like to have
Yeah,
parents
yeah.
that
Well,
have.
I mean, yes,
Right.
because like you had dad who's my parents were entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
I
Exactly.
grew up in the newspaper business, right?
Right.
And there's no, and so yes, you asked me why the work world, because that's where so much of our time is spent.
So as there and as you're talking, I understand it because I grew up in that environment. Now, what has been the biggest challenges though? What has been the biggest resistance when you try to approach some of these managers, these corporate execs? They say, I don't need this, girl telling me how to run my. How is the resistance? How have you been able to handle the challenges when it comes to just getting through to them and teaching them that they actually need this stuff?
Well, so actually, sometimes I, I now, like in the beginning, it was just
Hmm.
like, oh, well, let me try to explain. But actually, there are a lot of people who I actually don't try to fight people who don't think that they need it.
Mm.
Because that's another thing about the forms of respect, because people are like, well, what if they
Oh, yeah,
don't, what if they're
we're gonna
not
talk
willing to
about
learn?
that
It's like,
too. The book, yeah.
yeah, if they're not willing to learn, then it's not, you can't persuade them to want to learn. So
Right.
actually we work with organizations who do invest in relationship building, who do want to foster curiosity, who
Right.
do think, who the leaders are like, I'm not always right. I still have something to learn. There are a lot of organizations who do practice that. And then there are a lot who are just like, no, they're very transactional. And we work with organizations who are relational and who are I want to get better at this. So the analogy, Aswan, do you know the five love languages?
Yeah, I do. I do know.
Yeah, right.
I love that. I have that.
And the reason why I bring that up is because with my book, Seven Forms of Respect, because that's one of the
Yeah.
things we do a lot,
Oh,
is it's kind of like seven forms of respect is kind of like five love languages. And
oh,
the
is that
analogy
part
I
of it?
like,
Is that how you were able to come up with the book idea?
yeah.
Okay.
But like just I like to say, just like five love languages does not help abusive relationships,
Mm-hmm.
seven forms of respect, curiosity around respect, curiosity does not help people who don't want to learn.
Who doesn't want to
If you
learn? Right.
don't want to learn, I cannot instill that desire
Mm-hmm.
in you. So that's where as an entrepreneur, and this is like me, entrepreneur tip here,
Yeah,
don't try to persuade people who
I
don't
don't.
want to buy
I don't want to get
what
it.
you have to offer. There are a lot of people who want to have what you want to offer, and you just need to frame it in a way that they'll understand.
Mm-hmm. I love that you made that point, and where I'm kind of thinking is the person who wants it, but isn't kind of higher up on the totem pole, and they may be hearing you talk, they may be, run into your world in some way, shape, form, or fashion. And you did make the point of, assessing the situation when a person just has to let go of the job. If you're not growing, if you're around people that are just not serving, you have to figure it out. Can you speak a little bit to that person who may want your services, but just knows that, look, it's not even I won't even bring it to my boss. I want to know how I would even get access to your world. So good.
I mean, first, I mean that because I really think about making the work accessible. It's like we do
Mhm.
lots of YouTube videos for free. We've
Yeah.
got the book. We've got lots of actually offerings that people can do on their own.
Hmm.
And then also just starting to talk about it with their coworkers and to
Right.
see if that there's traction that way. Because we've had some clients where it really started for some people who were just individually interested in it. And then it was just like, huh,
Okay.
well, and then they would just share the framework.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that when we talk about curiosity and respect, those concepts are pretty universal and neutral.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is it doesn't feel woo-woo.
No.
It doesn't feel like, oh, you're trying to get me into all this relationship stuff,
Yeah.
right? It's just like,
That's why I
yeah,
think it's a cool
curiosity is
way that you
important.
made
Respect is
sure
important.
the work environment. Yeah. That's
Right?
yeah.
Right.
Right.
And
Right.
all of these organizations have on their vision statement, curiosity. We care about curiosity. And then what we say is, 70% of people say that they face barriers asking questions at work. You
Uh-huh.
may think that is important, but let's talk about that.
Right.
Why is that? Why are so many people afraid to ask questions?
All right, so let's kind of do this. That if there's someone listening in, what's the filtering process in which they would kind of that you would take them through to make sure that they're sort of ready for this knowledge? Because this is and I want to make sure I make the point too. This isn't a short-term commitment, guys. This is, like she said, you're spending most of your time either working or thinking about work, think about how you're going to pay the bills, and it's going to affect every element of your life. So you can't be thinking it's going to be a quick fix. You can't be thinking in terms of short term. You're going to do this work. This is a lifelong commitment that you're making. So it's important that you kind of put it out there in terms of who you filter out, who's going to be the people that are going to, go the long haul and all that kind of stuff.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the three elements of practicing
Yes,
curiosity, and then I'm going to share the questions I ask when I'm talking to someone to see if it's the right fit.
let's
So
do
the
it.
three elements, first is self-awareness, the second is relationship building, and the third is clear communication. So that first one, self-awareness, how do I be curious about myself? How do I want respect? What matters to me? Why? The second one is relationship building. How do I be curious about other people and let them be curious about me? So that's reciprocity. That's back and forth. That's how we form relationships when we exchange. And the third is how do I listen to understand, ask questions when I don't understand, and how do I tell specific examples and stories from my life?
Hmm.
And so then I ask people at your organization, on average,
Hmm.
on a scale of 1 to 5. So I say, what's the level of self-awareness?
Hmm.
Then the second one is, what's the scale of 1 to 5, what's relationship building like?
Hmm.
Then the third question I ask is, how how would you rate people on their ability to listen to understand?
Hmm.
What about asking questions to understand? And the
Hmm.
last one is being specific and giving sharing specific examples and stories. And so from each of those, they start to share
Hmm.
all the other things. And
Hmm.
so maybe it's like they're pretty pretty high on self-awareness, but they're low on asking questions
Hmm.
and sharing specific examples. And they'll typically explain why.
Hmm.
And so from there, we're able to go, oh, okay, it sounds like you could need this or this. And
Right.
um, yeah,
So what are some of the results that you've gotten, like the feedback that you've gotten for the clients that have worked?
yeah. So here's one of my favorite examples is that so with the respect work, we like to ask who in your life, what influences how you think about respect? And
Hmm.
so we had this one client who um, they when they asked that of their employees, and it was more blue collar workers, right? They had expected people to talk about their social identities, like their race, their gender. These are the things that influence. They were so surprised by what they learned.
Hmm.
And they heard, I'm a plumber or I'm a customer service rep. This influences. And so, how I like to describe that is oftentimes when we're trying to have these conversations, we say, here's a list of boxes. Check
Hmm.
off check off a box. And in our approach, we say, what's important to you? You tell me. You tell one another. You start those conversations. That requires practicing inward curiosity first. I have to ask myself before I can share with you. And
Yeah.
so that for that client, they learned about their employees in ways that they had not expected to learn.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's like the self-awareness part. And then another one in communication, we had another client who said after their org went through the training, they had to release some really bad news.
Yeah.
And then from that, but this time the people's reaction to the bad news was not uh not negative about the news itself, but negative about how it was communicated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a difference, right? Because it's like they understood that the bad stuff was going to happen, but what they were reacting to is like, well, we wish you had communicated it this way because that would have felt more respectful to us. That's how we want respect. Not
Right.
that they were trying to be disrespectful, but it's more of this is what we want. And so even that little distinction of moving away from the content to how it was delivered was a major change.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, this is so important that we get a hold of this. You and I could probably talk for hours upon hours about situation after situation in which adults go through a lot of adult stuff. And for you to
Mhm.
just show up to work and you deal with a person that only cares about the outcome, only cares about the ratings, I mean, that is a really crushing 8 hours. And know you got to kind of muddle through it, get your check and bite your tongue. I think the point that you made about most of the time, a lot of employees don't even ask questions. They're scared to ask questions. That's a really heavy statement, seeing that this is how you get an employee and they're scared to ask questions because nobody wants to lose their job. Everyone is just
Mhm.
trying to get through and pay the bills and all that kind of stuff. It's a very nasty place to be. So, I do want to give you the opportunity to just speak on, how, what do you see as the next phase to your business? And how can someone support you or get in touch with you if they want to, help move the vision forward?
I want the world to talk about forms of respect the way we talk about love languages.
Yes. Oh, actually, let's talk about the book. We gotta
Yeah,
we
yeah.
gotta
So
finish.
I mean, so here it is. So I
Yes.
want one day for people to say, "Hey, these are my forms of respect. What are your forms of respect?" And you know what that assumes is we want to respect each other and that we do respect each other. It just looks different. And so that's my big dream. And so the ways that people can help is check out my videos, go to YouTube, Curiosity Base. I have a video where I'm acting out the different forms, spread
Right.
the word, watch my TEDx talk. It's a as an entrepreneur, it's the work of marketing and spreading the word is hard.
It is a
And so this
lifetime
is,
job.
it's just
This
like
is all you
grassroots
do.
effort,
Yes.
hustling. It's just like, hey, please watch it. And if you
Yeah.
like it, then share it.
Yeah.
That would be so helpful.
Yes. And so put the name of the YouTube channel is what? Is it
Oh,
everything?
it's curiosity based.
Curiosity based.
Yeah.
Curiosity based.
Mhm.
Okay, that will also be included in the show notes as well. So, Dr. Julie, the way I close out all the shows is I want you to use your imagination a little bit. You are, let's say, a 13-year-old girl. You are seeing your parents run this newspaper. You're starting to develop some business concepts of your own. I want you to pretend that young Julie has come into the Zoom room. Give her some words of encouragement, and we'll officially close.
It's going to get better.
Yes, yes, that's right to the point. It's gonna get better, man. I felt that. Did you want to say anything else? No, because that hit me.
just,
I
yeah,
did not
just,
mean to
yeah.
interrupt you on that one.
No, it's just going to get better. It's just like, don't worry, it's going to get better. Yeah, 13-year-old, that's a lot of angsty. That's an angsty age.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, and you had, like I said, you had the business and the entrepreneurial vision going ahead and moving forward. So, like I said, keep doing the work you're doing. I'm all about it. I'm all about innovative teamwork. I think there's so many business owners, especially the business owners that tune into this show. So much of it is needed in our work environment. I come from a sports background, knowing how much we communicated, knowing how on it every coach was. The transition to the working world, quote unquote, for me is something I don't even know if I'll ever be able to just fully adjust to, but I know it's a difficult task. So we'll definitely make sure we stay in touch when it comes to all that stuff. So all that being said, fellow teammates, continue to move swiftly. We will talk more soon.